Welcome to our podcast, Roman.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm looking forward to the adventure of this conversation.
Yes, so you are always my inspiration, and I'm very happy to invite you to this podcast as the very first guest.
Well, it's a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Because this is the very first episode in this podcast, I myself don't know what I do. So yeah, I'm so excited what we will see and we will hear in this podcast. So reflecting on our relationship, so I am the translator of your book, Good Ancestor, right?
Yeah, and it's been fantastic to know that you've done that and have read it so carefully and thought so hard about everything that's in it.
Yeah, so yeah, I also have an experience to be an author of my own book, and which was translated into other languages as well. But I've never been familiar with the translator so far. So yeah, it's very unusual to me too, to be a good friend with the author of the original book.
Well, that's the same for me, actually, because, my books have been translated into maybe 25 languages, and I don't know any of the translators except you. And, I've learned a lot from it because you've had to, look at my work so closely. I sometimes think more closely than I have, looking at every sentence, what it might mean and how to translate it and the different possible meanings of concepts in Japanese compared to English. So it creates a kind of unusual bond, I think, and form of communication.
Yeah, so there is a podcast I often listen to, which is On Being. The personality is Krista Tippett, and so she starts every episode asking this question to the guest: what is your spiritual background? So I like this question, but as an ancestrist, and we are ancestrist, so I like to slightly modify this question like this: what kind of ancestors exist in you?
That's a very beautiful question. What kind of ancestors exist in me? I would say that my instinctive starting point to answer that question is a sense of tragedy. And by that, I mean that in many ways I feel cut off or severed, like by a knife, from the generations before me and the generations that come after me. And I think I feel that because of the culture that I have been born into, a culture of Western individualism, a culture of consumer capitalism, these kinds of big structural forces which I think diminish the sense of the connection across generations, which I think exist in most of us quite naturally. I mean, as we know, if you ask most people, talk to a lot of people about that sense of ancestral connection. I mean, most people will probably know their grandparents, right? So that means a connection going backwards 2 generations. And if they have children and if they're older, they might know their grandchildren or great grandchildren. So immediately they're within 5 or maybe 6 generations of time.
Yes.
So I know that for myself, but I think everything in culture is telling me to think about me, like the self-help industry or therapy culture or, economic free market culture. It's not asking me to search for those connections. So when I do think of what kind of ancestors exist in me, of course, I do think backwards. On one level, I think back to my grandparents, at least, because they're the ones who I have known. And I know that there's been so much more before that. And at the moment, and this is quite interesting, I'm applying for a passport from Croatia to become a Croatian citizen because my grandfather was born in Croatia. Now, I don't even speak the language, but I have been to a village in Croatia where almost everybody, or at least half the people, have the same surname as me.
Oh.
And I once went into a bar and I said to them, I said, I'm a visitor from Australia. My surname is Krznaric, or Krznaric as I say it. And I'm so excited because I saw in the cemetery of the village that about half the people had my same surname. And I went into the local bar and there were like 7 people in the bar. I said, I'm so excited. I've met some of my ancestors in the cemetery. My surname's Krznaric. And this one guy at the bar turned to me. He said, you Krznaric? I said, yes. He said, I am Krznaric, Josip Krznaric. And then he turned around to other people in the bar. It turned out there were 4 out of 7 people in the bar had my name.
Oh.
Now, in terms of what kind of ancestors I think exist in me, at that moment, I felt this sense of depth of connection, like roots going into the soil. That there were all these past generations from that village or nearby that I had a connection to I'd never met. They were still strangers. But that was also a complex realization because this is an area where there had recently been war. I mean, the war in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Now, the people in my village that my ancestral village, I don't know, but I think they may have been involved in killing people in other villages, right? Because of the conflict, Serbs versus Croats and so on. And it was very difficult to talk about those issues. I tried to, I couldn't really do it. Right? So when I think about the ancestors that are in me, it's almost the whole of the human story going backwards.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of then looking forwards. And I think probably more than most people, I feel the future cestors, that's not really a word, but I feel those generations to come as part of who I am because of the books, as you know, I've written, thinking about our relationships through time. Just yesterday, I was preparing a talk that I'm giving in the Netherlands in a couple of days' time, and I took a photograph of my daughter, who's now 15, and I used a aging app which turned her into a 90-year-old, so she looked sort of old and wrinkled.
Yes.
Right, and we all have these on our phones now, but to look at it was quite shocking, but in a good way, right? So I felt that her future was inside me somehow. It's a little bit like those Russian dolls, the babushka dolls. You have a inside the big doll is a smaller doll and another doll and another doll, and
Matryoshka.
Yeah, matryoshka, exactly. And so I think in a way, one of the ways I look at my life is as an exploration to discover all those other little dolls going in both directions. I mean, if I ask you, what kind of ancestors exist in you, where does your mind go? What do you start thinking or what do you start feeling?
Yes. So yeah, thank you for asking. Um, so of course, I have my own father, mother, grandfather, mother, and grand, and so and and I'm originally from Hokkaido island, the northernmost part in Japan, where the ski resort Niseko is getting very popular across the world, and so when I'm asked about my ancestors, uh, since I became Buddhist monk, uh, one of the ancestors who had a big influence on me was my mother's father, grandfather. So he, he was a Buddhist monk uh, who was in charge of a temple in Hokkaido.
And did you know him as a child? Was he
Yes,
alive?
yes, in
Yes.
person. Yeah. So when I was a child, he was still alive, and yeah, I often visited his temple as a grandfather's father and mother's house, as a grandchildren. So yeah, so I didn't succeed his temple, but yeah, for sure, uh, he had a big influence on me to what to do after graduation from university. But so among many among many good ancestors, in the lineage of Buddhism, I have many other good ancestors, like Gautama Buddha, Honen, Shinran, Nagarjuna, whoever, many monks, Buddhist monks and nuns, great people. So one of the feature in your book or in our book, Good Ancestor, is that the use of ancestor is not limited to direct family ancestors, right? But to more extended meaning. So I can, yeah. So as I told you, so the Gautama Buddha is not my blood ancestor, but yeah, he was not Japanese, and he was 2,500 years ago. So, but still, he could be in my ancestor, one of my ancestor. So yeah, so of course it is natural for human beings to feel very intimate to direct family ancestors, but starting from feeling that bond to direct family ancestors, we can also extend the feeling to broader people. Then we can also reflect that vision to the people to be born in the future, right? So in the book of Good Ancestor, so the future generation is not, of course, our own direct children or grandchildren, but also the people, right, to be born in the future. So yeah, I like that feature in our book.
I was just thinking, if I was a tree and I could speak, if I was a tree, I would say, well, that sounds like quite an anthropocentric, human-centered view. Why are you only connecting to future people? But what about the world that they live in, the living world, the trees, the plants, the oceans? And it's sort of interesting to think about ancestors on that broader level, because, of course, in some cultures, and maybe in Japanese Buddhist cultures that you're familiar with, maybe I don't know how much those connections are made, but I remember having found out a little bit about in Aotearoa in New Zealand, in Maori culture. As you know, there's this concept of whakapapa, and whakapapa is a word that's about intergenerational connection, this sense that you're connected with the past generations, but not just the people, but also the rivers and the mountains of your ancestors. And this also goes into the future as well. So I'm wondering, like, for you, do you feel that sense of a wider connection with the living world beyond human beings?
Yes, that's very important point. So, as a Mahayana Buddhist, I have been wondering what my role is in this society. So I am coming to find that as a Mahayana Buddhist, my role is cultivating people's sense of interbeingness. So the human being is interbeing. So the great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh said, everyone is interconnected. Everyone is interdependent. Everything is reflecting each other. So under this philosophy, in terms of time frame, it is very powerful to invite good ancestor philosophy, right? So the people in the past to people to be born in the future. But at the same time, we can also cultivate our sense of interbeingness in terms of space. We live here as a human being. Even among human beings, we sometimes and often we create separation, and we tend to create walls. And of course, we have the common concept of human rights, right? We all share. But beyond this, we could also think of animal rights, plant rights. Yeah, we don't need to say right, just human, animal, plant, micro, whatever, so to the planet. So yeah, so in terms of time and space, we can and we need to cultivate our sense of interbeingness. And my role is to help people do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I certainly, for me, that's part of what the journey is as well. But it's quite difficult, I think. I'm looking right now as we speak at two large trees outside my window in the garden.
Mhm.
Now, I know those trees are creating the oxygen that I breathe and my children breathe, right? So they are my external lungs. And the idea that my body or myself ends at my skin is like kind of an illusion, because those trees are part of who I am. And I kind of know that on some rational level. Um, but to try and really feel it, I find difficult. That's, to feel it deeply. Something that I did find a very useful thought was when I read about the Canadian environmental thinker, David Suzuki.
Mm.
And in a book he wrote, I think called Legacies, reflecting on his life in his 80s, he was talking about how, when we breathe in, we are breathing in the argon atoms that may have been breathed in by the Buddha or
Ah,
by,
yes.
Cleopatra, generations past, and we breathe out again, and those same atoms will be breathed in by future generations. And these are all incorporated into who we are. And I found that quite a beautiful kind of thought, thinking very much on that micro level about how ultimately the borders or the walls, as you say, between us break down in this very fundamental biological sense.
Yes, yeah. So I agree that it is easy to say, easy to think, but still not very easy to do, easy to uh, be live with, to live with. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, the way I think about this a lot is that we need to work with we need to work with who we are. So by that I mean, most people, as far as I can see, feel a much closer connection, of course, to their children, to their loved ones, than they do to a tree or to a river or to a stone. Now, some people really feel those nature connections unbelievably strongly. I don't think most people do. That might be cultural, it might be to do with evolution, whatever. So, what I try to do when I'm talking to people about these things is to use that family personal connection as a bridge to something wider. So often when I'm talking to people, as you know, about being a good ancestor, I will get them to imagine a young person in their life that they care about, their child or grandchild, and then imagine that young person when they're 90 years old and the world that they live in and what they would like to do for the future world of that young person who's intimately part of their life. And what I'm trying to do when I'm doing that, and what I often say to them is, when I first did that kind of exercise, I imagined my daughter in the future, aged 90. And what I realized was that when she's 90 years old, she is not alone in the world, floating in space. She's part of a web of human relationships and also part of the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. And so in that sense, the imagining of the future generation is a bridge to a more universal care about something much larger. And I think as a emotional and intellectual exercise, creating these bridges can be important. And maybe this discussion we're having is a kind of a bridge like that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So now let's continue the conversation.